All right, hello, people watching this panel. My name is Luke Pilot, and I'm going to be moderating it. Our panel on decision-making and its many components. So I'm going to be discussing decision-making and its components in relation to Remainder by Tom McCarthy. Why don't we have everyone else go around and introduce themselves for you, the viewer? Let's start with Sydney.
Hi, I'm Sydney, and the book that I read was 1984, and I discussed how totalitarianism affected people's decision making.
Matthew.
My name is Matt Lorenzo. I read Thomas Hardy's The Mayor of Casterbridge, and I discussed fate, the inescapability of the past, and its relation to Darwinism.
Nice. Laura.
I'm Laura Segura, and I read The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and I'm going to be and I mostly talked about how Freud's psychoanalytical theory applied to Dr. Jekyll and his psyche.
All right, great. Thomas.
I'm Thomas Corcoran. I read Watchmen, and I mostly discussed the moral implications of the choices made in Watchmen.
Okay, great. So decision making is a very interesting topic. So why don't we just all start speaking about our opinion on how that, just a general statement about how that relates to our books. So in my book, Remainder, I kind of discuss specifically in my writings about it, about how decision making, it often follows patterns, we normally act in ways that we've acted before, or at the very least that other people have acted before. And I think that's something you get to see a lot in Remainder, where the main character, the protagonist, unnamed, he often does things that repeat his past actions without him knowing it. This is also represented by the fact that he notices the fact that everyone else is doing things that are similar to their past actions without knowing it. So what do anyone else think about that?
I think specifically for my book, my main character's decision making, like before, his main decisions were based on what society, society standards, and he'd make all his decisions of does it fit like society standards. But then there came a point where he didn't want to he still wanted to fit society standards and like be able to feed like his parts where like it didn't fit society standards. So that's what led him to split his personality for my book.
So let's start with my book. Let's talk about Remainder. So Remainder is a book about, patterns. People act in ways that the general subject of human behavior is that people act in ways almost like fate or predestination, where it's similar to the way they acted before. And one other interesting thing about it is that it's almost unknown. So you're subconsciously leaning towards decisions that you've already made. And I think that's a really interesting topic. But it also begs the question of how many of our decisions resemble previous decisions we made in the past. What percentage would you say? I mean, do all of them really hold some resemblance to something we've done before? Anyone have an answer to that?
I mean, in essence, everything is just a yes or no. Every choice is just a yes or no of doing something, or no, not doing that. So in a way, all choices are mirrors of each other.
Sure, but how often is the choice you make essentially the same choice as you made the day before? I mean, I think a lot of people believe in change as a person, and this kind of goes in the face of that. You're constantly making essentially the same decisions, putting yourself in the same situations, whether you're doing it knowingly or unknowingly, for the comfort of doing what you already know. So how often would you say that happens? How often, or rather, maybe it'd be easier to say, how often would you say that you make a decision that goes against what you would be expected to do? What would be expected of you based on what you've already done?
I think that personally, like for me, I probably make like kind of the same decision every day, but not like I'm not aware of it because I feel like like as Thomas said, kind of every decision that you make is going to be a mirror of every next decision that you make, like regardless. And so I feel like we probably like every day we're probably making like decisions that are the exact same. Like we all choose to go to school, we all choose to wear our uniform a certain way and stuff like that.
I also think that like there is a comfort in just repeating the same decisions, like not changing it up. And I guess as like I guess especially in me, like I really sometimes I don't really like change and I rely on like the same pattern, which goes into like what you had mentioned before.
Yeah, I agree with all of you guys. How like we all make subconscious, like almost subconscious decisions because we all like kind of repeat the same thing over and over again. And then I also agree with Laura's point about how there's the comfort in making the same decisions because of like I guess the fear of the unknown and like you don't know what'll happen like if you do like change something up.
So this is an interesting idea because one thing that neuroscientists have been working on is asking the question of when do we make decisions in our brain? You know, sometimes you do things without really actually choosing them. There's no actual thought process to the choice being made. You're just acting in your natural progression of things. So an example of this would be, let's say I wake up and I turn off my alarm. I peel back the covers, I maybe get a drink of water from my bedside, and I do that exact same thing without actually thinking about it every single day. I mean, how often is that subconscious thought? How often are you making decisions subconsciously without even thinking about it? How often do you actually need to think and choose things in your daily life?
I think if you've gotten into a routine, like wake up, go to work every day, like a lot of your day will be subconscious like decisions. Like there have definitely been days where the day just like goes by really quickly and I don't remember like doing that much or because I think most of the day was with like subconscious decisions like when you're driving, you're going through the same route, doing the same things, seeing the same people.
I mean, certainly it's easy for someone to like fall into a routine, as everyone's been saying, and almost live life on autopilot.
I agree with both of y'all's points, but I would want to add that like it's also like at our age, it's pretty hard for us to like fall out of that routine anyways because we like have to follow that routine because we have to go to school and like we have to drive ourselves and stuff like that. So even if we wanted to like it's hard for us to actually be able to like choose those things because we have to do them regardless. And I think that's why we make so many subconscious decisions.
I
What
feel
about
like
patterns we don't know that we're choosing? Hypothetically, let's say there was a child who was constantly failing classes. He was going through the same cycle. Let's say, what's making him fail? Let's pretend that every night he goes to sleep at 2 a.m. because he is watching TV all night because he likes TV. He is consciously making those decisions to watch TV every night. And then as a byproduct, he's constantly failing these classes. So that's another thing. You're in patterns that you don't even realize because of the ripple effect of what your actions do. And I think that's a really interesting point on this. And I think it also begs a different question of, is it actually possible for you to make a decision that strays away from what your past decisions show is expected of you? So that's a bit of a complicated question, but let me try to explain my reasoning with it. So essentially, if you were to watch someone for, let's say, a full week, see everything they do, and maybe you're like have superpowers, you know everything that they think, you can learn a lot about them, but you can also learn a lot about their decision-making process and their motivations. And so with that in mind, if someone were to do that, let's say for your entire life, would you be able to trick them? Would you actually ever be able to make a choice that surprises them? Or would everything you do be expected? Is everything you do expected based on the patterns of what you've already done?
I think that even if you were to stray away from the pattern of what you do, it would still be expected because your straying away would be influenced by the pattern that you've already established. So then could you ever really like trick, like, is it possible for anyone to really trick the person? Because everything that you've done in that pattern would influence your choice to then stray out of that pattern and would influence what you did in order to stray out of the pattern.
I feel like this also brings up like the problem or even the answer of like what is fate? Because is fate nothing than just like a prediction of choices you're going to make based on the past?
So Matthew, I know you had a lot to say about fate in your book. So what do you think about fate in this instance?
Yeah, in my book, I guess just to give a background to it, Henchard, the main character in the very beginning, he kind of sells his wife and his child, and then he then like steps up in society throughout his life, becomes the mayor. But then the way that many other readers and myself spread it was that he was trying to kind of just fix his mistake, and he kind of dwelled um, on the mistake instead of like actually trying to fix it, or maybe he dwelled on it too much while trying to fix it, and he kind of lost sight of actually trying to um, like get better. And then people say that you have to move on to like make things better, and I feel like he wasn't able to move on, which is why in the end of the book, even though like he showed shades of actually trying to change, in the end he never really ended up changing, and he was still the same person that he was in the very beginning of the book that sold his wife and his kid.
All right, that's really interesting. So that brings up the question of change. How often does real change happen? Is it possible for someone to change? What do you guys think? Thomas, do you have any opinions on change? Is it possible for someone to change?
Well, I believe people can change. I mean, no one is the same person that they are when they're born. Every choice you make, every choice someone else makes eventually leads everyone to change and become the people that they are.
I think for change, like my book is like an exception, I guess, because the main character, they did cause a change in themselves, but it wasn't natural. It was an unnatural way that they changed themselves by like taking that potion, which then caused them to become like form a different whole other personality. But you could argue that the other personality wasn't really them, but that was an unnatural change but it was a big change.
So let me ask this. When a wrong decision is made, can people or characters escape from it? Or are they focused on dwelling on it their entire lives, that their whole life revolves around it essentially? Or do they attempt to amend said mistake? What do you guys think? Matthew, any opinions on that?
Well, again, in my book, I don't think the main character and any other characters were able to truly change, but I feel like that was kind of like the author's like purpose. I feel like he was trying to show that fate has been set in stone and that it's really hard to make a change. But I myself feel like people really can change if they really like put their mind into it, and then they kind of just like put everything into it and then make the really big effort to change.
So you believe a change is possible, but requires some large amount of effort on the part of the changee. That's interesting. That's an interesting take on it. So what would constitute a large amount of effort? Like, let's say you are an axe murderer and you really love axe murdering, but one day you axe murder someone who you liked by accident. How would you go about changing in the future? You've committed this serious crime, you've committed it on a habitual basis. What would you have to do to be able to change your decision-making process?
I think by consciously, like every time that you feel the need to axe murder someone, if you like consciously challenge yourself, um, like bring up like, do I really want to? I know I really want to ask this person, but if you like consciously try saying this isn't the right way to go, I think that is a effort to change.
Sure, but would that be a large effort? Matthew specifically stated that it needs to be a large effort. I mean, that's a very small thing. I mean, this hypothetical axe murderer does have a conscience doubting whether or not it's the right thing to do already. So, what would you actually go about doing if you wanted to change?
I feel like something that might seem small, but it's actually like a long ways, like acknowledging and accepting that what you're doing is wrong, or like that you want to change. I feel like that's a really big step.
Also, bringing other people into it, I think, if you try and say, if you can't trust yourself because it's become such a habit and you feel the strong need to keep doing this, bringing somebody else would be another, like, I think a large way to change.
I think an important question is whether or not he actually does enjoy the axe murdering. And
I suppose that is an important question. I mean,
and maybe it's an outlet for him to get out his anger about society and the government.
yeah,
Going on all those axe murderings, he needs some way to vent, and he just so chooses to axe murder.
yeah, venting is like good. And venting against the government is something very interesting, especially when you think about the fact, not an idea, it's a fact, that the government really makes a ton of decisions for people. Sydney, I know you talk about the government, specifically a totalitarian government, which makes far more decisions than our own representative democracy government for its citizens. So, how would you say that our decisions here are restricted or controlled or otherwise influenced by the government?
First off, that was a really good segue, so good job, you. And I think, like, if we're talking about us as Americans, I think that the government influences our decisions a lot more than we want to admit, because there's the half of us that really align with what the government says, depending on what party is in charge, and like really believe in the government. And then there's the other half that hates whatever the government's doing, depending on the party and stuff, and then like chooses to, do certain things just to spite the government and stuff like that. And I think that that's like, I think that's very interesting, because even though you like don't like the government, you still, that still becomes a part of all of your decision making and like how you go about life, even though you don't want that to be how you go about life. And I find that interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that is very interesting. I was speaking more about the government limiting things, but you rather talked about it enabling things. That when you don't like the government, it might enable you to act in ways against it. So that's even more control that the government's having on your decision making without you even knowing it. Because consciously, the government's prohibiting you from committing crimes and other such things of that evilish nature. But I mean, they also enable you to do some things subconsciously, like they overtly encourage you to vote, but that also subconsciously changes the way you think. They have you talk about politics, think about it, and the way you think about politics also has an influence on the way you act. So I don't know about the rest of you, but the government didn't really play a role in my book. Thomas, your book discusses vigilantes and such. So how does the government play a role in that?
So in my book, some of the superheroes are controlled by the government. It's not a big piece in what I talked about, but it's a decent portion of the contents of the book. And there's one character in it which is exclusively controlled by the government. His name is the Comedian, and he does terrible things in the name of his country, but also just because he was a terrible, terrible person who had superpowers. So he was just able to go on a government-sponsored rampage through Vietnam.
Sydney, any comment on that? How that relates to your book?
obviously my book is a commentary on totalitarian governments and government overreach and like letting terrible things happen in the name of maintaining a country. So I find that really interesting, and how like government sponsored violence, because in my book there is also government sponsored violence. um, might be getting into murky waters here, so I'm going to try not to like go too far into it and like not spoil the book or anything like that. But like a big part of my what I was writing about was that the main character, even though he was making all of these decisions to like rebel against the government and like try and forge his own path in the world, all of those decisions were either directly or indirectly influenced by the government. And like some of them would be like bad in our eyes, and like some of them are bad in only the government's eyes. And so I think that's really interesting, and like kind of relates to Thomas's, not as much, but like government sponsored violence, that's how it relates.
Yeah, what do the rest of you guys think of government-sponsored violence? Matthew, yay or nay on government-sponsored violence?
I was gonna kind of bring up in my book, there was no really government like controlling anything, but it was kind of society, and like the setting that they were in was kind of, I guess, controlling it. So the setting for my book was a kind of like a small town, and the main like I guess economic income that they had was like farming. And during the time there was like a rise in technological advancements, and so the town was evolving and changing, but then the main character refused to let go um, of his old ways of farming, and he still used he used like a weather, I guess like witch predictor kind of person, like predict the weather, and used old techniques of farming instead of like new machines that were invented, and which is what also led to his downfall. So there was no really overarching government controlling them, but it was more of society changing that affected the people.
I also, the same thing with Matthew's book in mind, that there was really no government involved in it, but also like just society, like um, not controlling, but definitely playing a role in the decisions made.
So, Laura, if there was no government control, what was the greatest component that affected how the main character of your book made decisions?
Just, I guess, definitely in the, well, society basically just trying to, because they were a doctor, and they were in like the upper class, and so they still wanted to be able to do some things that weren't really deemed acceptable, and so that's what led them to their downfall. And because they tried to still do those bad things, but on the
Well,
down.
I believe you can be specific as to what said bad things are for the purpose of clarity.
Oh, like when Dr. Jekyll, the main character, when he split his personality, um the side of him that was started to do bad things, started like killing people, and like was really rude and went over a child too, like bad things like that, that still satisfied, like, I guess, his id in him.
Yeah, I mean, those are three pretty bad things. I mean, killing people, being rude, and running over a child is pretty equally bad deeds right there. So does morality play a big role in the decisions being made by Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde? Does he ever consider it?
Not in, definitely not in the beginning, but when he sees that like all the bad things, like just how bad it's getting and uncontrolled that Mr. Hyde is having in his life, I guess his morality does come into play, and he notices he's losing himself and tries to get back his morality and like make a stand against Mr. Hyde, but then it's too late because Mr. Hyde already has like too strong of a hold on it, like his body.
It's too late, huh? So it became too late for him. Doesn't that imply that it was too late for him to change? So that I think begs a different question of, is there a point where I think a lot of us said that it is possible for human beings to change, but is there a point where it becomes too late for them to change? Laura just expressed that it's too late after, I don't know what the climax of the novel is, but presumably after some climactic event, it becomes too late for Dr. Jekyll to take control back from Mr. Hyde. So does it ever become too late to change? Is that an actual possibility in real life?
Oh, sorry, where are we gonna go? Okay. I think that there is a certain point that people can reach where it's too late to change. And I think that like that point, the way that I would define it is like if you get to a point where making amends will no longer help you like redeem yourself, then I think that you're like unable to change. Like someone who, we're using a lot of murder today, but like someone who like murdered children or something, there's a point where they can't like change at that point. Even if they like express a desire to change, they wouldn't be able to change because making amends wouldn't help them be able to redeem themselves, at least in like that's my best way of explaining it. Like once you once being sorry isn't enough, then you can't really change your course or your.
Well, I had a pretty big question about that. When does being sorry become not enough?
when the people who when the people who are accept I think that, let me actually say a sentence. I think that saying sorry isn't enough once the people who are supposed to receive that sorry would never be able to accept it. Like, and I mean, obviously that would then like be not objective, and like, you know, it would be very subjective, and depending on who the audience is, there's a possibility of not like ever getting forgiveness or anything. But I think that like if overall, like if the general consensus was that saying sorry won't help anything, then like that's the point when a sorry would no longer work, obviously.
I actually disagree with Sydney's point. I think that you to be able to change doesn't depend on other people's forgiveness. I think it more depends on your own mentality and whether you've decided that like it's too late like to give up, or whether you think there is a glimpse of hope, I guess. And
Oh, you can finish. Sorry. Oh, yeah, I was gonna agree with Laura and say like going back to Luke's question about like when is it too late. I personally feel like it's never too late until the person that's trying to change kind of gives up on themselves and says that they can no longer change.
I feel that change in this case is like in the example of the repentant murderer, morality plays a really big role because like even if you just think of it as like a scale, like killing a child will, you know, weigh down morally up on a scale. Like you can't just go from, oh, I murdered a child, now I'm nice to people. That doesn't make you a good person because now you're nice to people. You still murdered that child.
Well, is there a certain point where you can atone through that, through your decisions? Like, let's say you didn't murder a child. Let's say you did something that would be considered better than murdering a child. Let's say you murdered a teenager. Now, rather than murder, and it's like a really mean teenager, so it's okay. So, once you murder the teenager, you decide, you know what? I'm going to be not just a really nice person, I'm going to be the literal best person ever. Because you feel so bad because you murdered that teenager that you're going to be like, okay, I'm going to be such a nice guy. So you start giving to charity. You can work on the suicide hotline and you save all sorts of teenagers' lives that would have killed themselves had you not killed that teenager. All those teenagers that you just helped on the suicide hotline would be dead. So really, I mean, you maybe saved, let's say, 37 lives over the course of the next 25 years of your life before you die in some random way. So is that okay? Did you atone for yourself? You killed one teenager, but you ultimately saved the lives of 37, I believe I said.
Well, that's up to each individual person. Like for me to say oh, he's atoned. That's my choice, and that's how I would see him. But if he still feels the need to like keep doing it, has he really atoned? Does he really feel like, yes, I've done it. I atoned. I'm a good person now. Because can it's a matter of like, has he forgiven himself? Like, it doesn't matter how many other people have said, you've atoned, you've atoned. Does he really feel atoned if he's still doing the good acts?
Does that matter? I mean, I blame myself for random things that I know isn't my fault that other people wouldn't blame me for that aren't even intrinsically wrong. Like, let's say, let's make up an example again. What if I, what if I accidentally threw a baseball at a picture frame and I broke it? That's not something that would be considered very bad. But let's say I tried to atone for that by giving the person who gave, let's say it was in someone else's house. Let's say I try to atone for that by giving them $25 a week for the rest of my life. I mean, I think we'd all agree that that's a bit of an overpayment for something as small as breaking a picture frame. Is that, I mean, what? But I still feel as though I need to atone because let's say I've been the Virgin Mary. I haven't sinned my entire life. That's the first thing I've ever done wrong. And so naturally, I feel very bad for it. And if I don't do anything else wrong my entire life, that's the only thing I really have to atone for. So, Thomas, does my opinion actually really matter? Because I don't think it does.
Well, I mean, you I guess have felt a change of, oh no, I'm a bad person because this one bad thing I did that I still need to atone for. So I think that's where the change happens, is in your opinion of yourself.
So, let me ask this about ourselves. I think one interesting question I found was what is the limit of control that can be placed on someone's decision making ability before they can no longer be considered a being acting on free will? So I think that's an interesting question. So let's all talk about that. Let's start with, I don't know, Matthew.
Sorry, what was the question? Can you repeat that one more time?
What is the limit of control that can be placed on someone's decision-making ability before they can no longer be considered a being acting on free will?
I feel like in our society today that I feel like the government is doing a pretty good job, or like society is doing a pretty good job of allowing us to act on our free will. Like certainly, people should be able to do as they please and do what they want. But if they do something that harms others, there certainly should be punishment, and there should be like a consequence for their actions.
So I think my question worked better if I phrased it like this. Is it possible to take away someone's free will? Yes or no?
Yeah, I definitely think there's a way to um, take away someone's free will by, I guess, kind of just like forcing them and telling them to
All
do
right,
this
put a pin in
one
that
thing.
for a sec. Let's go down the line. I want to hear what everyone else thinks about this first. So just one word, yes or no. Is it possible to take away someone's free will? Sydney?
Yes.
Matthew?
Yeah.
Laura?
No.
Thomas?
Yes.
All right, and I'm in the no category, so it looks like we got a debate. All right, Matthew, go for it.
I feel like if like someone more powerful than, let's say, like me or someone else, like if they like forcibly say like, oh, you can't do this or else there's going to be repercussions or punishment, I feel like after a time, like if the person still tries to go against what they're saying, like they'll realize that like they really can't because there's always going to be punishment, and that they'll end up like falling into whatever the overarching power will be. So they'll just end up doing like what they want them to do.
All right, let's have the yeses speak. So, Sydney, what do you think?
I think that obviously, like with a threat of violence or death or anything like that, you no longer have free will because it's in our nature to try and stay alive or try and not get hurt. And another way of like taking away someone's free will would be like maybe not this way, but like also under a threat of violence or something, and have already, like, you've already decided all of the options, so there's no choice of them like getting to choose what happens. They only get what you're presenting, because then you're controlling the situation.
All right.
I think there's a few ways to look at it, and one of those would be like, if you want to go with the fate example, then if you believe in true fate, then no decisions are real and free will doesn't exist. Another way you can look at it is that you can, again, with Matthew and Sydney's point of, you can threaten away someone's free will so that their choices are actually yours. But I feel there's another way of like sensory deprivation type thing. Like, if you take away someone's ability to have influence on someone else, then that essentially takes away their free will, because they no longer have any effect on anyone, including themselves.
All right, let's hear a counter argument to that, Laura.
Well, I don't think you can ever like fully take away someone's free will. There's always going to be that choice. Even under the threat of violence, you're still choosing to do it, even though it is being swayed, or not swayed, but I guess there is a greater let me just skip over that point, but it's still being influenced, I guess, your choice. It still is a choice that you are making, I think.
All right, that's more so the camp I follow in terms of logic. You're always still making a decision, no matter what threat or what's swaying you. Because the thing is, different things will always sway you to varying degrees. If someone were to say, hey, give me a penny, or if I'll give you a penny if you tie my shoe for me. Now, I wouldn't do that tie a shoe thing for free, but if you give me a penny, I might. So are you taking away my free will by doing that? I think most of us would say no. But what happens when you gradually increase the motivation of that? You increase it to $1, $2, $10, $100. Eventually, you're going to keep decreasing the odds that I'm saying no until it appears as though I have no shot of actually saying no. But over that entire chance, I still have the choice. If it's $1 billion, I'm still choosing to say no. I still have the option to choose to say no. I obviously wouldn't. Actually, I probably would, but you're still making that choice regardless. And so linking that back up to what Sydney said about violence, if you're being physically threatened, physical threats can range. Let's say your parent says, go clean your room, or I shouldn't use that example. Let's say that someone says, give me your wallet or I'm going to flick you, like that. That's not a very big threat, but it's still having an influence on your free will. You're threatening them, you're making them feel threatened. And so that threat can gradually and gradually and gradually increase. It's a threat of violence, even when it's just a flick, to, stabbing, to killing, to getting a bludgeoning hammer and really causing you some pain while they kill you. But all the while, you still have your free will. You're still choosing whether or not you want to go along with it, and you can still ultimately choose to say no.
Well, I mean, even if there's only like a 0.1% chance of you saying yes, isn't that 99 whatever continuing percent chance always yes? So in essence, the choice is always yes, because you would never make the choice of like, if I don't high five this person, they're going to stab me in the kidney. You're always going to high five them. There's no realistic chance based on logic, social norms, that you're not going to high five the man if he's going to stab you in the kidney, because there is no logical reason why you wouldn't high five this man to not get stabbed in the kidney.
The odds are negligible, but I guarantee you, out of the 7 billion people on Earth, at least one would do it.
I agree with that point. There's just, even if like most likely you're going to do it, you still are choosing that. Like, you still have that choice, even like if there's barely any chance that you're going to choose like the latter.
Yeah, like, I mean, your odds change. Like, for example, I might be the most likely person on Earth to agree to that high five stabbing deal just so I can go out proving that I'm right about this. I mean, it's always a possibility, and the odds are always in flux. And we don't know what other conversations someone else is having. You know, maybe there's some other kid who also wants to prove this exact conversation right about always having this free will. I mean, there's so many different possibilities that even if the odds are negligible, the fact of the matter is you're still making the choice. It's an asymptotic approaching, but that still means that it never actually reaches 0%. So anyone else have any other opinions on free will? All right, great. So we did have another question submitted to us that I think we should discuss. Um, so, how do people's moral decisions get affected by others? I think that's a good question. Anyone have an opinion on that?
My entire point of my book was how morality affects decision making, and I feel as though like how your decisions affect other people is very important to most stories and life, and overall that causes change. I'm sure all of you have heard of like the butterfly effect type thing, like every choice everyone makes is going to change something somewhere. Even you like holding the door open for someone means that someone walked further and did that, and it goes on, you know. And I don't know where I'm going with this, but I mean, everyone's choices affects everyone else's choices and changes everyone.
All right, I think that's a pretty good answer. So I got one more thing I think we should discuss. So there is a theory of time travel that I think relates to decision making very well. So the theory is the absolute nexus. Essentially, it states that if you go back and change a decision, eventually the timeline that you changed will match the timeline where you didn't change it, meaning that there is, to a degree, predestination. So, for example, let's say I go back 100 years and I push someone, really hard in the middle of the street. And that has a ripple effect that changes things very much for the past 10 years, for the next 10 years, from 1921 to 1931. But by 1931, the effects of my pushing become negligible, and the timeline reaches the point where it completely matches this timeline that we're currently in, where I didn't push anyone. And this kind of furthers the idea of fate and predestination in terms of decision making. So what do you guys think of the absolute nexus? Do you believe it? Do you not believe it?
Would this only apply to like small things?
It applies to all things. Large things would take longer, but everything would ultimately reach a matching.
Like at the same point? Like
Things would eventually end up the same way, meaning that everything happening on Earth simultaneously in one world would completely match everything simultaneously happening in a different timeline.
So like even Archduke Ferdinand not being assassinated, because that has had an effect of all of history, or has had effects on all of history since his assassination.
The theory states that eventually the world would reach a point where human life where everything happening on Earth would match everything happening on Earth had he not been shot. It would take a while, but it would eventually happen. What do you guys think?
I don't think that would. I don't. I don't. I don't know how to word this, but I don't think that would work. Because like with stuff, like the example that I'm going to use is like racism. If racism was never existed, then there's a lot of different things that would never happen. And I don't think that in a world where racism never existed, you could ever line up with the current world that we're living in.
You couldn't line up with the current world, but what about the world of
I
1,000
don't even think you
years
could
from
line up with the current world. Quite honestly, I don't think
now?
you could.
I know, you saying you couldn't line up with the current world, but could it line up with the world of 1,000 years from now? Or 10,000 years from now? Could the world where racism never occurred match the world where racism did occur in 1,000 years?
I don't think that that theory is right.
I don't think that the theory is right.
Well, not okay. I don't agree with that.
No, that's fine. I mean,
Because as Thomas was saying before, like the butterfly effect and all that, I think that that truly does play like a large scale, like a large role in other decisions and other things that come into play. And also, like somebody being murdered, then they're not going to be able to have their, maybe they were going to have kids who are then going to like solve something. You know what I mean? Like cure something, whatever. That really like greatly changes the outcome. And also I just, yeah.
Yeah, I kind of agree with everyone that like I don't believe in that theory. Like it could be correct because I just feel like things happen because of previous things that have happened. There's kind of like a domino effect. I feel like if you were to take something out, like I guess I'll go with Sydney's racism, like analogy, or yeah, like I feel like if that never happened, like I just can't see like a world like today or like in 1,000 years, like it just wouldn't like match up.
Yeah, and I think that like even if the day-to-day life of the two worlds were the same, they would still be fundamentally different because one is influenced by the existence of racism and one isn't. So even if they like appear to be the same, they still wouldn't actually be the same.
interesting points. So that would be true fates, essentially things that you could not, that everything that happens has to happen. You can't really change it. But let me ask this question. Is it a possibility that certain events exist within an absolute nexus? For example, some things have to happen and there's nothing you can do to change it. Now, we don't need to talk about specific events because obviously, through time travel, like obviously, if someone were to like kill me as a baby to stop me from typing on this keyboard right now, obviously that can be done. But what about more conceptual ideas? Like racism is a good example. Is there something you could do other than mass extinction of the human race to prevent racism from ever occurring? Or is that just a fundamental part of decision making?
Well, I think it gets to an even more simple point. Like, I think the only point that can constantly exist would be like the start, because that's the only case that can be the exact same with no decisions made, nothing affecting anything else. It would be the start, and then everything else is not possible to be the same.
I also feel like if like any other situation, like other than like the start at the beginning, and if like something has to happen, then I guess that kind of also takes away like your free will, like going back to our conversation from before.
I think that was a very interesting discussion. I mean, we all had some interesting points about decision making. Anyone have any other topics or ideas they'd like to discuss? Anyone want to make any final words about the topic of decision making? That would be the time to do so. All All right, great. Then I think it's time we bring this panel to a close. Thank you all for listening, and and the thing, dude.